Hello and good evening to another live Q&A session. We'll just wait for a little minute till we get a few more people in the room. It's telling me that we're live on all three channels now, on Facebook, Twitter and YouTube. So when you're ready, please start posting your questions. Hopefully you can hear us and see us a bit better than last week. So that sounds good. First of all, I'd just like to introduce you to Dean Kinsella. I'll let Dean introduce himself. So over to you, Dean.
Evening, Sam. Evening, everybody else. For those who don't know me, my name is Dean Kinsella. I am an NIC area engineer based in the London area. I cover most of North London. My job, as most of you who are NIC contractors will know, is to assess the contractors against technical standards. So you will know of me, those who live and work within my area. So good evening to you all. Hope you're all well.
And good evening to you, Dean. You've been assessing today, remote assessments or on site?
No face-to-face visit today, Sam. I have been in the wonderful world of Windsor. Popped over there to see my old mate, Henry VIII, and to chat with a few of his wives. We never got round to them all in time, unfortunately. To see one of the contractors based over there. And then we had a little jolt over to Kensington. Looked at a couple of rewires and interestingly looked at an electrical vehicle charging point that was installed by the contractor as well. So good day was had by all, and the weather was beautiful as well. Sun was out, skies are blue.
Sounds good. So we've had one question come in straight away. I think based on your accent, Dean, they've asked whether you're red or blue, but we'll answer that right at the end. We'll answer that at the end if we've got time.
Fair enough.
So without any further ado, we'll mention first of all the question that we had in the week, which we thought was worth talking a little bit about. So that question was, are the maximum permitted disconnection times for devices used to protect against short circuit the same as the disconnection times required for protection against electric shock? In a nutshell, no. Because it's very different. Short circuit's a different type of fault with different potential hazards. So I think we're all very used to when we're looking at earth fault conditions. So ZS, we know that's protection against electric shock, and we've got our defined times. We're all fairly familiar with 0.4 seconds and 5 seconds that we need to disconnect within, and that's because when we're looking at earth fault, we're looking at a fault current in things which shouldn't be live but might become live under fault conditions. For example, conductive casing of an appliance. So when it comes to earth faults, we might touch that appliance where there's a fault and become part of a circuit and therefore receive an electric shock. So we're very concerned about disconnecting very quickly before that harmful fault current has time to damage the person, so it's harmful to the human body. When it comes to short circuit conditions, it's very different. Short circuit is an overcurrent in things which should be live, so typically your live and neutral conductors, and so therefore we shouldn't have access to touch those. So, we rely on basic protection, insulation, barriers and enclosures. So whenever we're trying to, if we were to touch, we shouldn't have access to something under short circuit conditions. So we're not as concerned about touch. All we want to do is make sure that the protective device disconnects in time before those cables carrying that short circuit can come into thermal damage, so potential fire starter, for example. So when it comes to short circuit disconnection, there's no defined times. It's very dependent on what the fault current is, how big your cable is, and how quickly the overcurrent protective device disconnects. If it disconnects before the cable has time to damage, then we've met our short circuit disconnection times. Whereabouts would we find information on that, Dean?
Well, for those of you who are familiar with BS 7671 2018, you're looking in part 4, really, to be fair, to find most of the information. Chapter 41 will give you information on protection against electric shock. Obviously, you've got chapter 43, which discusses the overcurrent side of it that Sam mentioned earlier, and sandwiched in between two of them, you've got chapter 42, which discusses the thermal effects as well. So you've got the access to information in BS 7671, and also for those who've spent the extra pennies and invested in the IET guidance notes, there's information available in the guidance notes as well.
Yeah. And with respect to short circuit disconnection, there's actually a formula on page 92, I think it is, of the regs. So it's in the overcurrent protection section, chapter 43, that'll show you how to work out, based on your fault current and your conductor size, how long that conductor will carry that fault current before it's thermally damaged. Now, if your protective device disconnects quicker than that, then you've achieved short circuit disconnection.
Yeah, what they've got to remember, Sam, is obviously it's a design situation there to ensure they've got the right size conductors in place to withstand the energy let through and the thermal effects that pass through the fault current side of the situation. It's no good addressing it later on. It's something that you've got to factor in at that design stage.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we'll go to the board and start to pick up some of the questions that have come in. Let's have a look. Is a high R2 reading on a ring final circuits always an F1, or is it just higher, etc. 0.05 to 0. So if 1.67 times higher than R1? So I think it's saying that if we've got so we can do our 1.67 to calculate or estimate what the CPC should be. What would we do if the CPC is higher than what we estimate it to be? Would it always be an F1 on an EICR, or is there anything else we would recommend? Any thoughts on that, Dean?
Yeah, I mean, obviously you want to go through the circuit itself and check the connections to each of the accessories would be a good starting point. Also, what you've got to consider in the ICR is the fact that depending on the age of the installation, you might not be getting that 2.515 factor between the live conductors and the CPC, so it may be giving you a higher reading. Older installations, I think it's pre-1960s, I'm led to believe, 2.5 mil. So obviously you're going to get near enough double on your CPC. So they need to do a few more checks first before jumping to the assumption that there's an issue. And also, they can also check the R1, R2 as a test, and then be looking at their fault loop impedance readings with their meter as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So
FI would warrant wouldn't warrant an FI based on just the higher value alone. They could do further checks or do a comparative to the size of the conductors, or doing a ZS will still give them hopefully a disconnection time that's suitable to BS 7671.
Yeah. So if you're still achieving your disconnection times, and it's reasonable, so as you mentioned, you've tightened everything up, it's slightly higher but not overly high. I think the other thing is, if it's available, comparison against the last test, because obviously if it hasn't changed, you're not sort of too concerned. If it's massively changed since the last time, then you've got to kind of question, well, is it potential damage? What's caused that change? Is it likely to get worse? So yeah, I think you've got to also factor some of those other things in.
What I would say, Sam, is I suppose an added question would be, as a bounce back from the person who asked the question, 99.9% of times there's no pre-existing records to compare their values to, as we know at present. Obviously, moving forward, that will change with the legislation for private rental sector, but as it stands now, there's limited records available.
Yeah.
When you
absolutely, I fully take that on board. That there's very rarely any evidence of any previous tests or installation certificates. So something else that you might consider then is, well, perhaps reduce the time to the next one. So if you've got a slight concern, but you're not overly concerned about the safety right now, you could perhaps factor that in when you come to recommend the date of the next inspection, because then you can sort of see, well, is it getting worse? And then there's a trade-off. Does the customer want you to investigate it now, or is he happy with more repeated tests, just to make sure that things are staying okay?
Just to answer the question, FI no, more likely worst case is C3, but then you'd be looking at a much higher CPC in comparison to your live conductors. But I don't believe an FI would be warranted there.
I think that there's a follow-on question about the times, disconnection times when we've got a 2.5 with a 1 mil CPC. That won't affect the disconnection time. So, the disconnection time is a characteristic of the protective device. So the fact that you've got a smaller CPC will actually mean that you'll have a higher resistance, and therefore you'll have a smaller current, which could result in a longer disconnection time. But the times that you've got to meet, 0.4 or 5 seconds, depending upon the circuit, don't change. But having that smaller CPC will be detrimental, because you'll have a lower fault current, which will result in a higher disconnection time.
Yeah, and that goes back to our question before, Sam, that we were discussing the chapters 41 in BS 7671 about the cable calculations and the energy withstand of the conductor. Yeah. That's going to carry the fault as well. Yeah. Good follow-on.
Okay, what else would we get? What code would you use for 100 milliamp RCD on a TNCS system? So if we're looking at that question on the basis that for additional protection we require a 30 milliamp RCD to achieve that requirement for additional protection. 100 milliamp RCDs generally not going to give you the same disconnection time, i.e. 40 milliseconds. If that's the case, if it is just additional protection we're not achieving, and we have got adequate fault protection, then we'd be looking at a C3, unless it's a situation like a TT where we need both. So in general, because it does depend very much if what we're talking about, sockets or is it just cables in walls, for example, then if it's a requirement where just additional protection, like cables buried in walls, like lighting circuits in domestic, and we haven't got that 30 milliamp because it's being protected by 100 milliamp, then we'd recommend a C3, providing we've got adequate fault protection through our breaker or our fuse. Anything you'd add to that, Dean?
I was just thinking about the question that was put forward and the focus on the 100 milliamp as opposed to no 30 milliamp RCD protection. I was looking at it from a different angle than you. I was thinking, would they be coding it because there's a 100 milliamp RCD present? But again, going back to what you're saying, that might have been put in place because there might be high ZE value at the origin, or high ZE value, high ZS values on some of the circuits. It just seems strange how they've worded the question to focus more on 100 milliamp as opposed to no 30 milliamp RCD. But
yeah, it's a fair comment. We've got very limited information. It literally says, what code would you use for 100 milliamp? And you're right, perhaps we're going back to the old days of having an upfront RCD, and it's 100 milliamp rather than 30. So perhaps it was installed before the requirements of 30 milliamp RCDs.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see what else we can pick up that's coming through.
And just another note on that last question, Sam. Obviously, they got access. If they got access to Best Practice Guide 4, it does list the more common C1, C2, C3s, and FIs within that particular free issue guidance to give them further information with regards to what part of installation require 30 milliamp RCD, i.e., like you said, luminaires, special locations, cables within the wall, sockets for general use or sockets for outdoor use. So I guess there's more information needed from that question, but Best Practice Guide 4 should give them more information. Obviously, it's got to be issue 5 to reflect the 2018 changes as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we've got the a common question that comes in. Can I put a standard plate switch into a bathroom? So what's your thoughts on that, Dean?
Straight answer, yes. However, it must be outside the zones. So outside of zones 1 and zone 2, 0.6 away from the edge of the bath or the shower, with your height of 2.25. If you're outside of them zones, it's no zone. Therefore, they can have a light switch within there, depending on the size of the bathroom, obviously, as well. So yes, inside, or they can put it outside, or if they're not quite sure, then they can go for a pull cord. But yes, as long as it's outside the zones, you know.
Yeah, once we're outside the zones, we meet the requirements of 701. It's probably still worth saying you still have to consider environmental conditions. So parts 1 to 6 still apply. So you do still have to think about condensation, moisture, potential splashing. But yeah, if your bathroom's large enough to get outside the zones and you've got, for example, good ventilation, then it's possible. It's permitted, as Dean says. So we must be outside the zones, and then it still must be suitable for that place. Let's see what else we've got coming through. I've 2 questions, if I may ask. Split concentric cables, thought of them being installed by an electrical contractor from a sub-main to each consumer unit in the housing block. So that might be the first question. Split concentric, so where we've got that outer core that's got dedicated neutral and dedicated protective conductors, we're happy, providing of course it's sized suitable for the requirements. The concern over concentric cables is where we haven't got a split concentric, we've just effectively got a 2-core concentric that's typically used by the distributors in their pen conductors. So where we've got a PME system or a combined neutral and earth system, and those are what not allowed or permitted by BS 7671 within the installation. I think experience tells us that in the old days where we had things like large blocks of flats, large office buildings, the distributors would quite often be involved not just in the supply to the building but also within the internal distribution, and would often still therefore use a normal 2-core concentric cable, which we wouldn't be allowed to install at the moment in compliance with 7671, or currently I should say, not at the moment. We've got no idea that they're coming in. So that's where it comes. But if it's split concentric, where we've got independently identified and adequate neutral and protective conductors, then that's a different story. Split concentric, not a problem in principle, so long as it's sized correctly.
Yeah, I would say the same as you, Sam. Obviously, depending on whether they intend to install this cable, or whether this is part of a periodic inspection and testing, the information that you've given there, I totally agree with, to be fair. So yeah. no further information or comments on that one.
Okay, looking at the questions as well. Should submains have RCD protection? Say, for instance, in an apartment block where you've got 25mm, 16mm in trunking, as far as you can see, possibly run through walls, floors, ceilings, and if no RCD, is it a C3? So, submain cables and RCD protection. What are your initial thoughts on that, Dean?
Well, it's a yes and no. Obviously, if it's existing, which it sounds like they're talking about, can they confirm that the submains cable, is less than 50mm within the fabric of the building, which is going to be very hard to determine. Obviously, the areas where it is surface mounted, as we know from the regulations, there's no requirement to have 30 milliamp RCD installed, because the likelihood of it being damaged is minimal. But then it doesn't mention in there whether they've installed it, if it's an armoured cable or not, or it's a soft skin, PVC. If it's an armoured cable, it's got the extra mechanical protection, therefore it's not required to have the RCD. If it is a PVC, 10mm or 16mm, and it is going to go through fabrics of the building, and it is going to be less than 50mm, then unfortunately, yes. However, it's not ideal, as you know, because if you've got that at the front end, the slightest fault is going to trip that, which is going to take the whole installation out that's downstream of it, which is an inconvenience to the consumer. So ideally, no, but if it's less than 50mm, then yes.
Yeah, and just taking up that point, so what can you do to try and remove that requirement for an upfront RCD, so that you only need the RCDs on the final circuits?
Basically, your two options on a distribution circuit is to ensure it's surface mounted throughout its run, from the upstream device, overcurrent protection device, to the connection of the fuse board, or go for a mechanically protected cable like an SWA. So they're your kind of two options, or ensure that the distribution circuit, if it is a soft skin PVC, is more than 50mm within the fabric of the building, which would be pretty hard on an existing building, because you know, sometimes you're taking floorboards up and you're putting rods through and using conduit to get the cable from A to B. It's not the same as an installation that's totally been ripped back to the wooden frame, where you've got the access to clip it along its route. So
yeah, I think that's spot on. So it's often preferential to either select a cable or a route that means you don't need additional protection for the submain, and then you can have your additional protection devices on the final circuit. There's no real benefit in having two 30 milliamp RCDs in series, because the one closest to the supply is always going to detect the imbalance first. So that's the one that will trip, and then the homeowner or the office owner looking at the board can't understand what's tripped, because everything to them will appear on, because like you say, you'll lose everything if you trip the upfront. So yeah, it's often advantageous to design it so that you use a cable or you select a route that doesn't require the additional protection of an RCD. Let's have a look. When would it be practical to install a time delayed RCD? So that's something perhaps similar and leading on. If you wanted, for example, so let's say we did have an SWA submain that doesn't require 30 milliamp protection, because it's SWA and we earth the armouring. If you did want to give that enhanced protection, then you could put an RCD on it to give it that, trip much quicker to detect a fault, much more not accurately, but to detect a fault much clearer than an overcurrent protective device that needs 5 times its current rating typically to operate instantly. So you might say, okay, this is an important supply, perhaps to something that's critical to the business in the distribution board. So you might want to RCD protect that distribution circuit, and then to give you selectivity, or as in the old days we'd call it discrimination, between the 30 milliamp device and the upfront RCD. That's where you might consider putting, for example, 100 milliamp time delayed, to make sure that you get adequate selectivity or discrimination between that and the final circuits in the board that require 30 milliamp protection. So that would be an example. Let's have a quick an existing submain within the fabric of the building to me would just be code 3. So yeah, if it requires RCD protection because it's less than 50 mil. Cable greening, is there a code for it? So this is our green goo.
Yes, good old green goo.
Good old green goo comes back from time to time, mostly in the summer when it's warm. But so what can you tell us about the appearance of green goo, Dean?
It's green and smelly.
Yes, yeah. There are two things about. Well, there's one thing about green goo. Two, it's green and it's gooey. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, basically, there's not much you can do about it. It's a phenomenon. It's the plasticizer from the original days of the newer style PVC from I believe the late 60s, early 70s. Yeah. There's not much you can do about it. Coding wise, I guess it depends on the damage it's causing to the installation. If it's just signs of it, a little bit here and there, then I'm not even sure if a code 3 would come under it, personally. But then looking along the lines of the extent of the green goo, where it's starting to go down the inner insulation, starting to go into the contacts of your light switches or your sockets, I think then you've got to maybe consider further action. And by that I don't mean you may fail it. You obviously be looking for other signs with installation. So initially it might just warrant an observation, because it's not a non-compliance from BS 7671. However, depending on the damage it's causing, may heighten that observation and the code required.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. We have to go back to our basics, that our coding is based on safety of the installation for continued use by the users of that installation. So in itself, it doesn't cause electrical damage. So yes, you've still got to do your insulation resistance testing and make sure that it hasn't detrimentally affected it. We're not aware that it does. But then, as Dean says, if it is excessive, then it can get into the accessories and the devices at the ends of connections. So things like breakers that have got mechanical movement can be affected if it's excessive. So yeah, on its own, it's not directly unsafe for the users of the installation, but it can cause an impact. And it should also be said, in some instances, again, when it's excessive, it can be slightly caustic to people with sensitive skin. So yeah, but it obviously it looks very messy. It ruins the decor, but that's an aesthetic thing, not a safety thing. And there is no answer, as Dean says. It's something that was resolved in the 70s, and it shouldn't occur on new cable now. But there's no answer other than rewire. It's a chemical reaction between the copper and the insulation. It tends to be more prolific in the summer when it's hotter, because it is heat. It's that chemical reaction that's caused by heat. So it does seem to be exacerbated a bit in the summer. Okay,
Just
we'll
to add on to that one,
yeah.
Sam, very quickly. Obviously, I know it's unsightly, and obviously there is no other way apart from a real wire. What would your take be on a coding with regards to mechanical damage to light switches and sockets and circuit breakers? Would you slap a C3 on it? No more than that.
Certainly circuit breakers, you know, a C3 and a C2. If I when I functionally tested them, found that they didn't work. Switches depends, doesn't it? Because if, for example, it's the light switch in a rental property where you can't assume that the people would know their way out in the dark, then you might consider coding it as a possible C2. Generally, though, light switch, the fact that the light switch doesn't work isn't going to cause an electrical hazard. So yeah, a C3 at most typically. But you do have to think, right, could this cause an electrical danger to the installation? Certainly the protective device would, but switches and sockets generally not, but depending on what they're used for. If they're there to provide you know, an emergency light, an emergency socket that provides you know, a life support system, then you've got to think, but those are the rare ones. Okay. I'm just thinking that we're coming to an end, but we'll answer one more. Let's have a look. Depends on your IR results. Yeah, I think we mentioned that with the green goo. It does very much depend on your IR results. Let's just see if we can pick up on anything else new. On this, please can you clarify? Let's just have a look.
I guess with most codes, as we were discussing previously, Sam, it is down to the inspector to make that decision, because they're the ones that are on site and they make the judgment call on the severity and obviously the concern that can be caused to each installation. It's not a black and white situation. Going back to the goo, it is a case of discussing with the client and seeing the impact it may have with regards to any coding before you record it. So.
Yeah, absolutely. As with most instances, you know, it does depend on a number of factors. So the inspector needs to know the type of installation, what the potential hazards are, who the users are, how things can become electrically unsafe for continued use by those users. So yeah, it's not always a straightforward black and white question. Let's just see if we can pick up one more. I'm just trying to sort of drift through the comments on the current answers compared to a new question.
While you're looking for that, Sam, I'll just entertain our guests. I am in fact a Liverpool supporter, and for the Manchester United supporters out there, I think you were lucky to get a win yesterday.
Oh, that'll cause a riot.
It was a very good game, but I think the winning the team that should have won didn't on the day. Bit like Luton, eh, Sam?
Yeah, we were robbed. 2 balls on the pitch. That's all I'm going to say. You know, Alex Ferguson wouldn't have allowed that first goal. Okay, final question. When supplying a hot tub that will be installed on a grass garden, would you install an earth rod, and if so, would you earth the tub to the rod or use the supply cable earth to earth the hot tub unit? We've got a very good article on this that was published either in the last Connections magazine or the one before, or if you're a registered contractor.
2020, I think it was early on in 2020, maybe the spring or maybe the summer or autumn.
Yeah. Because this was last summer's top question to the helpline. Everybody seemed to be installing hot tubs, perhaps due to the lockdown and people not going on holiday. There's nothing specifically that says you must TT a hot tub, and in fact most hot tubs are class 2, so it's not a requirement. But you do need to consider the appliance itself, consider the manufacturer's instructions, because they should give guidance if it isn't class 2 and if it does need an earth. And that would be the thing. If it is sitting on the grass, and you're supplying it with, for example, a PME earth, and people can step out of the hot tub perhaps still in contact with something that's connected to PME earth, then if that's the case, you wouldn't want to let them simultaneously have contact with true earth by standing on the grass in that ideal situation of bare feet, wet, so body resistance is at an all-time low. So that would be a strong consideration, but please refer to that article, because that article was very good. A lot of people seem to think you must TT a hot tub. It's not the case, and in most instances it's not required, because the hot tub itself doesn't require an earth due to that class 2 classification. And of course you can do other things like fit, isolate and transformers if you want to remove the requirement, even if it is on grass. So no, there's nothing in BS 7671 that says you must TT a hot tub.
Yeah, the only thing I would add on to that is it'd be very interesting to see some of the attempt to try and rod the hot tubs that are made nowadays. So any pictures, please send them in.
Yeah, and you've got to be careful, especially when you're outside around the outskirts of the building, that you're not going to put a rod through surfaces. So consider that as well. If you're of the mindset that you're not sure, so you're going to decide to divorce the earth and fit a hot tub, just make sure that you fit in that earth electrode safely. Okay. I'm gonna call it a halt to that there. Thanks very much for the questions and taking part today. Thanks very much to the patience people showed last week when we had a few technical issues. I've been asked to mention those of you that take part in our Wednesday webinars, the Wire series. If you are interested in downloading your CPD certificates for those sessions, please make sure that you do within 12 months of the webinar first being shown live. Our server that looks after the CPD certificates will only store them for a year after the webinar first went live. So especially if you're watching an old one on demand, and it's coming up for nearly a year since it was originally broadcast, make sure that you download your CPD certificate as a PDF file, and then you can store it for your own CPD records, because once that webinar rolls over the 12-month clock, even though you'll still have access to view them, you won't have access to download the CPD certificates. So that's the first sort of news bulletin. And the second one is we've got another Wire webinar coming up this Wednesday on testing. So Nick Mitchell and John Elliott will be delivering that. So if you're a registered contractor, go onto the website and register your intention to view that. You can view it live, or you can view it on demand, or do both. Once you've registered that interest, you'll be able to view it as many times as you like, and get your CPD accreditation. So thanks very much for your time and joining us tonight. Hopefully we'll see, or more importantly hear from you again next Monday night. Thanks very much for tonight, Dean. Did you enjoy that?
Yeah, loved it. Yeah, thank you very much for having me, Sam, and for you guys out there, guys and girls. Thanks for letting me be a part of the Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube Q&A. I look forward to seeing you all soon. On a finishing note, just with regards to me, with regards to CPD that Sam mentioned, just make a note of any CP that you do as you go along, because as you'll be aware now through talks with your assessors, we are introducing CPD records that need to be shown, or need to be shown every periodic visit, to show self-development with regards to changes in the industry. So by accessing the webinars will obviously help to record that information on your own in-house training records. So apart from that, everyone keep up the good work. Good stuff.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and stay safe out there. Thank you.
See you later. Bye-bye.